Thanks for tuning in today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about human-caused biodiversity loss, focusing specifically on human-caused, not natural causes for this presentation. So, what are some of the root causes of extinction? One of the most important aspects is human population growth. And when we get into population growth, we'll talk a lot more about the different variables for that. But one of the big parts of that is in some places, there's significantly high population growth. In other places, there's not significantly high population growth, but there's high per capita consumption, meaning that like a place like the United States, our growth rate is not significant in terms of population increase of birth. We get immigration, but not a high number in terms of birth. But we have a very high per capita consumption, and so that is causing the environment to degrade very rapidly. And there are laws and policies in place, but not all of them support the environment in the way that they need to be supported. So here's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the human role in all of this. So for a long time, the role of the humans had very little effect on the species. You still see a bit of a decline just with humans being around in itself. But definitely of recently, we're seeing a huge amount of species decline as the human population grows. So there's definitely a negative trend there. Well, we talked about this before, but during the next 20 minutes, another species goes extinct. 3,500 humans are added to the Earth's human population in those 20 minutes. So as one species goes extinct, 3,500 more humans are born. So it's not evenly distributed in terms of population decline. So what you're seeing here are where you have some of your biggest areas of diversity. So if you look at this little key here, there's first of all some hotspots. So the little pink is showing us where the hotspots are, where there's kind of significant, important, it could be important groups, things like that, that are not found in other places. There's some places that are called what's called a mega diversity country. And then the orange is conservation areas. So there's certain places in some of these countries that are conservation areas, and I can't see the last key there, so I don't remember what the cross one. I think it's one that has mega biodiversity and conservation, but I could be wrong on that. So these are the top 6 hotspots in the United States for biodiversity. Not surprising that Hawaii is number 1. Part of it is if you look at the concentration of rare species, because the islands are far from everything else, they have some species that are kind of there only, or more specific to the area, are found in higher numbers there. But we also have quite a lot here. So what's interesting is, 3 of them or 2.5 of them, because this kind of overlaps here, are found in California. So Hawaii, San Francisco Bay Area, the Southern Appalachians is the next one way on this other side over here. Death Valley, so that's a little bit of California and Arizona, and then Southern California in general, and then the Florida Panhandle. So those are kind of like the most biodiverse areas in the United States. So what are some reasons this increased significantly from 1900? So first of all, what do we see here in this graph? It shows mammals, birds, and fish, and it shows the number of U.S. species and subspecies extinct. So we can clearly see the number of species that are going extinct are increasing from 1800s until, in this graph, 1986. So this is probably, I wouldn't think that this is specifically from climate change. Remember that way more in the recent years, we're seeing those declines. But what might be some other reasons? And a lot of it has to do with industrialization. So if you think, I'm not a history buff, so I don't remember all the times when that happened, but it's somewhere in this area here, we're seeing those numbers decline significantly. So that is probably one of the biggest reasons where we saw such a rapid decrease in so many of our populations. Industrialization means we're able to expand, means we're able to change our farming techniques, more pollution, etc. And that is why we're seeing some of those numbers increase in terms of extinction. All right, so here's a little breakdown of these different words because some people don't necessarily know what these are. So an endangered species means that there are so few individuals that a species may become extinct soon. So endangered species are kind of like the highest level of concern. A threatened species means that a species are starting to decline, and it's probably going to become extinct at some point, but they're not quite endangered yet. And then rare species are low numbers. They could become threatened. So it's kind of like rare species, and then they're considered threatened, and then they're endangered, and hopefully not becoming extinct, but oftentimes doing so. These are just some endangered species here: the California condor, the giant panda, a handful of different species here. You can always pause it and look at these if you want to. So let's talk about some of those causes. So these are direct causes of extinction. These are specific things that are happening. So the number one is habitat loss and fragmentation. As humans, we're expanding, whether it be expanding businesses or human dwellings, whatever it is, we are destroying habitats to make those homes. And we're fragmenting habitats that we're like, oh, we'll keep this habitat here, but we're breaking it up. And we've already looked at how that can be detrimental to certain species habitats. That's number one. I'm not going to go into detail for these because I'm going to talk about them on later slides. Next is invasive species or non-native species. Those are top two. As of right now, I'm saying climate change is kind of number three, but it is climbing. So as of right now, I'll call it number three, but in the future, it probably is going to be number one, if not already. Illegal killing and poaching and capturing, things like that. Predator and pest control, something that probably some of us have already done, like killing spiders or spraying for whatever in our houses. Capturing and selling exotic species like birds and things like that. And then pollution. So we're gonna go into a little bit of detail for all of these. So again, habitat degradation and destruction are the leading cause of species loss worldwide. As we chop down the rainforest or build on wetlands or expand in, Southern California's chaparral, that's one of the most specific reasons that we're losing species. This shows you so first of all, lost by 1950 and lost between 1950 and 1990. So a lot of the loss you're seeing on here is before 1950, and then the lighter orange is between 1950 and 1990. So a lot of this happened again in the industrial phase when we started converting things like grasslands to farmland. So a lot of that is what you're seeing here. We're turning these areas into something that we could use. Chaparral, that's actually what we have in Southern California. So that's kind of our process of building homes or whatever. So tropical rainforest is kind of a later hit. I think you'll find that if this were expanded beyond 1990, we're seeing a bigger range now than we did before. So the question on here is, why do you think the habitat loss is so much lower in the boreal and the tundra? And we haven't gone specifically into biomes, but the logical answer is that those aren't environments where humans want to live. Therefore, we don't need to destroy them. So tundra is very cold. Permafrost areas, boreal forest is only a little warmer than that. It's not land that we can specifically use in a way. I mean, we can, but not easily. It's not like we're going to make these into farms or things like that. Maybe places that are a little too cold for people to desire to live. And so that's why there's the least percent of habitat loss in those areas. Invasive species are the second leading cause. Other words for invasive species, you might hear exotic or non-native or introduced species. So all of those kind of mean the same thing. Here are just some examples of exotic or non-native species. We're going to talk about a few more of them in a moment. So this is the fire ant. I'm going to blank on Argentinian fire ant, I believe. And the green is where it naturally is found, and the red is where it has invaded, if you will. It's a non-native invasive species to these areas. Here are some that were deliberately introduced. Okay, so some species that were introduced were on accident. We'll talk about those in a moment. But these were all ones that were deliberately put in a place for various reasons. Some of it was aesthetic, right? Like, oh, this is a really pretty flower or whatever. I want that in our yard. And then they have no predators, no animals that help to control it, and it just grows like a weed. There's quite a few examples, and we'll talk about some more in class probably too. But these were all deliberately introduced for various reasons. This is an invasive vine. So some vines are very quick growing and they can take over. And this particular vine, I couldn't tell you the name, but it's actually affecting the tree's ability to grow. It's taking some of its resources away. I highly recommend if you ever decide to have vines near your house that you don't actually have it on your house, that you get one of those trellises, because when you have it on your house, it can easily turn into this, especially if you don't have time to do maintenance. So be careful. Vines can destroy the structure of the house because the roots, like how they attach to the house, can break up the solid nature of the house and make it weaker. So be careful. These ones were accidentally introduced. So zebra mussels, there's a lot. You might have talked about it in a biology class already. But zebra mussels, I think it's in the Mississippi, and they attached to a boat or whatever, and ended up in that area and really took over the natural mussels that are in that area because they have no predators and they're very fast growing. So one of the problems with introduced species is the fact that they usually don't have a specific predator that can control the population. So whereas like the native species has that balance in the ecosystem, these guys oftentimes don't. And so that can really affect the natural ecosystem without its predator. Global warming and climate change may become the leading cause of species loss in the future. This is a slide that I've made, at least a few years ago, 5 years ago, or whatever. So it's very possible that that's already transitioned to number one or number two, but it's still it's for sure detrimental even back then, and probably even more so now, even within the last like 5-10 years. We know with the ice melting, that's taking away homes for the polar bears, and it's increasing the distance in which they have to get to their food. So they get their food from the water, or they're on their ice and get the food from the water that way. And they're now having to swim further to get to another piece of ice. So they're using more energy, but they have less access to food. So it's a double-edged sword there. It's like a positive feedback loop. It's making the problem worse and worse because they need more food because they're burning more calories now, but they have less food available. So in these pictures here, so this is the East Coast, and what I want you to see in these pictures, so this is the current distribution, well, not current anymore, it's 30 years ago, but a map of the current distribution, and these were two predictions that they came up with for how the species might change due to climate change. And so what I want you to notice here is how the red basically disappears. So the elm and the ash and the cottonwood were up here, kind of the northern part of the East Coast, and they're essentially wiped out in both of these images. So that's something to really note, number one. Number two, both of these look relatively similar. There's a few differences, like this one has more yellow, which is the oak, gum, cypress, and this one has more, maybe a little bit more blue, which is the longleaf / pine. But what you'll notice is that this dark green here, so the oak and hickory, in both of these models, it looks like they're going to kind of migrate north. And why is because the temperature and the rain in those areas is going to be what it used to be right down here. Now this is going to match its normal temperature and water range, precipitation range, and so it's going to take over. It's not going to be the temperature that I said elm, ash, cottonwood before, but it's maple, beech, birch. These are now, it's too warm for them and maybe not enough rain for them or whatever, and it doesn't fit the biome that they need, the temperatures and conditions that they need, and so another species starts to take over. So those are the predictions for both of those models. So what is a characteristic of a potentially endangered species? If they are extremely localized or have large territory. Now, let me specify what I mean by that. So localized range, it's like if they're only found in a certain area, or if they need a large territory, not if they have a large territory, but if there's a species that needs this really large area in order to survive, and then we like fragment it, then they're not going to be able to live. If they have low reproductive success, so things that are K-selected are typically low reproductive success. For example, not that humans are going anywhere anytime soon, but humans are K-selected. And most mammals are K-selected. Elephants, let's use elephants as an example, because they spend a lot of time raising their young. They only have a few young at a time. And so that means that, they're not going to be as able to adapt to change. Whereas if you think of something like a frog or a fish, those are the R-selected. Those are going to have lots of babies. There's not a lot of parental involvement. Those typically have higher reproductive success. And so because there's so many babies, right? Like some of them are likely to survive. So the fewer that you have, the harder it's going to be to survive. Island species tend to be vulnerable to endangerment as well because, again, those are really extreme specialists. They can only live on the island. They don't have anywhere else to go, that kind of thing. So if their environment changes, they don't have the opportunity to kind of slightly move up north like those trees did in the slide before. And if they're not adaptable, some species are able to adapt quickly and easily, and some species are not. So those are what would make a species vulnerable to becoming endangered. So here's an example of a tiger species. This is the Indian tiger. And 100 years ago, the orange used to be its range, so quite a bit of range. And now the kind of reddish pinkish color is where the range is now. And there's only 2,300 left. And this is an old slide, so there's probably even less now. I don't remember why I put this on again. I'm going to skip it. Here's a handful of other tigers, and what you'll see again is the historical range. That bright orange is significantly more spread out than the current range. So you can see the kind of little sections here. Now there's all these little pockets, and the question, for example, for the Bengal tiger is, do these little pockets, can they even communicate with each other? Can they do tigers from here communicate with this one in terms of reproductive success, or is it like now limited to the pocket that's here? And also notice that some of them are actually extinct. There's no red in some of these areas, meaning that there's no current population of Caspian tiger or the Bali tiger. They've been completely wiped out. Now, the Indochina tiger here, there's at least some intermixing. Almost all of this section is at least intermixing. So that means that there's some more probably genetic diversity here than there might be here if they don't have the ability to get to one of these other areas, if it's so fragmented. In the South China tiger, there's a very small section left. So moving on to kind of the next section here, 5 million birds are caught legally each year. So this is the legal portion of this, but half of that are illegally captured. Okay, so you're still seeing a lot legally, but still a lot more illegally. And then 40, what was I saying here? I don't know what I wanted to say there. I guess maybe I'm trying to say 40 species have become endangered because of trade. So, they live in, I don't know, China, and we want to buy them in America. And so 40 species have become endangered because they're desirable in another place. One bird to a pet shop equals 10 that die in transit. Okay, so think about that. You capture 10 parakeets or whatever, and only one of them survives. Actually, 11 parakeets, and only one of them survives. So a lot of them die on the path to getting where they're even trying to go. Now, here's a picture of, obviously, it's a very dated picture. And this is, I don't have an answer for this one. I think this is a question that I've thought about in the past. So, not a huge fan of wearing fur, personally. That's just my own jam. However, these were furs that were from a long time ago. So, when you have something like an old fur, do we not use them or do we use them? And I don't know the answer to this. I'm not giving you an answer here, but these were already killed and captured for their fur or whatever it is. So, obviously we should not be doing that anymore, right? We don't want to go capture a cheetah just for its fur, especially those endangered numbers or threatened species. But if we already have them, should we be putting them to use? And I don't know the answer to that, because if you put them to use and they become popular, all of a sudden we're, hunting them again. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's just something to ponder. If we have all these old furs, like my mother-in-law's sister passed away and passed down some furs to her, and I was like, I don't know. What are you going to do with those? There's a Friends episode as well, if you're ever interested in seeing that one with Phoebe. Certain parts of the animal are also, like skulls or horns or things like that are desirable as well. And so that is sometimes why they're hunted. So hunting and poaching, right? So it could be because of the animal itself or a specific part of the animal that they're looking for, like the rhinoceros horns. I think they're called horns. Literally just killed for those, right? So like, it's not like they're using the meat, it's not like they're using the skin, they're just hunting for those. Not good. This was the black rhino's range in the 1700s, and now much limited. And again, a lot of genetic isolation, right? So I would imagine that these little blips up here are not genetically reproducing with these ones down here, which means that not only are you reducing your numbers, but you're reducing the genetic diversity of the ones that are left over, which can sometimes cause health problems as well. Think, incest when it comes to like humans who are too similarly related, and how those can cause genetic traits to appear. So again, lots of species. I do have some graphic photos in this next section, so just a heads up. So 622 species face extinction because of hunting and poaching. And the problem is that the rarer the species, the higher the price, right? So as something becomes even more and more limited, it makes it more desirable. The price goes up and it makes people want to hunt for them. There is sport hunting as well, so killing for recreation. Some of these are species that have low numbers, but some of them are not. In most areas where kangaroos are found, they're in abundance. And we'll talk about how sometimes it is necessary for humans to potentially interfere because of our relationship with these species already. So I'll get to that on a later slide. Asian or Indian elephant, former range and current range. Again, current is a little out of date. The numbers are probably even lower as it is. African elephant numbers are a little bit better, but still really different than what they used to be. Subsistence hunting is specifically hunting for food. So in some places, their only choice might be to hunt for wild animals. I wrote connection to the coronavirus because there was I don't know what people decided at this point, but there was some thoughts that the reason that bats were connected to the coronavirus is that someone was hunting bat for food. I don't know what they ever decided. Was it a lab? Was it purposeful? Was it not? Blah, blah, blah. I'm not getting into all that. But there have been, and not just in this case, but there have been illnesses that have come forward because of hunting for things that we as in, city dwelling people wouldn't necessarily hunt for. Like I said, some graphic shots here. So that is bushmeat. So that's a human that hunted some kind of ape species. I couldn't tell you what it was. And that was for food. Sometimes we kill for money. So commercial hunting, where there's some part of it that is giving us money, whether it be the coat or the blubber or whatever it is. We're hunting for money. We've done that for years. Predator and pest control. Most of the time, these are threats to livestock or agriculture or something like that. Like coyotes were hunted pretty significantly because we were worried about livestock and things like that. The wolf is an interesting case because the wolves were hunted pretty significantly, almost to the point where they were wiped out of Yellowstone. In fact, if not wiped out, and they were reintroduced to the Yellowstone Park. And this is controversial because they didn't realize the wolf was so significant, almost like a keystone species in that community. And so they reintroduced the wolf to try to balance out that ecosystem. And the park ecosystem has not rebounded, and they don't really know why. So it's still very controversial that they re-release them. They don't. Is it like it got too out of whack? Is it going to return to normal? Is there a way to return it to normal? Do we need to assist in some way? But the ecosystem is off balance, and reintroducing it did not give them the rebalance that they thought it would. Remember, we talked about fragmentation and those edge effects that when you reduce the kind of center part of the land, whatever type of ecosystem it is, you have more edge and less middle part. Sometimes those patches become too small to support some of those larger species. You have to have a certain amount of range for, let's say, an elephant or whatever, and so it can cause them to be threatened or worse. And if you have fragmentation, sometimes you have barriers to dispersal between patches, meaning that, again, you don't have that connection between this group over here being able to mate with this group over here, and you lose that genetic diversity. This is just examples of fragmentation in Wisconsin. These are in the 1800s. These top pictures, I can't see in this picture where these later ones are, but even in those 50 years, it's significant fragmentation, and very little is left to communicate between those two groups. We also have a problem in the ocean of overfishing. Part of that has to do with the fishing methods that we use, and we'll talk a little bit about them here. Part of it is the type of nets that we use, and I'll focus more on that when we get into aquatic lessons. So I'm not going to go specifically into the different types of nets right now. So 34% of fish are at risk, which is pretty significant. The biggest problems are in Europe and Asia. Those numbers are way higher in those areas. We're harvesting coral. It's a real bad time to harvest coral because coral's really sensitive to change, and we're seeing coral get polluted, or the temperature changes, and we're seeing them kind of die off. So even collecting them, because people like to have coral in their house, they think it's cool in their bathroom or whatever, it destabilizes the roof and decreases habitat for other species. It's definitely problematic. This is whaling, so you can see the effects of whaling is wiped out a lot of those species. We used to have a lot of them in the early 1940s. And this is when, hunting for whales was really significant for their blubber and things like that. Harvesting tropical fish for everyone's cool fish tanks. Some of the methods used, like cyanide, which is a poison for fish collecting, they use it to like knock them out to kind of make them sleepy. But only one out of every fish collected make it to the store alive, whether that be that the cyanide actually poisons them or in transit something happens. So one of every five. Not great. Anchor damage. So all those people, taking their boat out and whatever, not thinking about what's below. And so now there's a movement to try to do something about that, because obviously having boats come to certain places can help with ecotourism and things like that. So the conservation movement is to have these kind of permanent moorings where you attach your anchor to it. So it's to try to avoid hurting the natural environment there. So there's a movement to try to do something about that anchor damage. Believe it or not, dynamite and chloroxing are used to quickly collect fish. It literally smothers the corals, which obviously, I mean, it makes sense. You're using dynamite and Clorox. And so they sometimes don't immediately get killed, but the chlorine does kill invertebrates and fish in the area as well. So it's problematic for many species when they collect fish in this way. Just to go back to invasive species, these are some, I'm not going to go over these. I'm going to just say if you want to read these over and pause it, I recommend doing so. But read these over for what would make a successful invader who would do well if they're going to be an invasive species who's likely to survive as that invader, and why they would do better than the native species. And then on the other side of that, characteristics of ecosystems vulnerable to invader species. So these guys are going to be good at thriving, and then what might help them to thrive, meaning that other species are not going to survive. Okay, so exotic species, they're again introduced species. 4,500 species have been introduced to the United States. It's kind of a lot. It costs us a lot of money to deal with. It's not like this little thing, like, because it affects our agriculture, it affects ecosystem balance, it affects a whole bunch of things, and so it's really problematic. And 30% of endangered species are because of exotic species and invasive species. So that's kind of crazy, right? Like almost a third of all the endangered species are because of this. So introduced species oftentimes have no natural enemies, and that is one of the biggest reasons that nothing happens, because they don't have anyone to hurt them, right? So then they can just grow or reproduce or whatever. Oftentimes they're also better at doing whatever they do than the natural species. So if there's a natural grass or whatever, and we introduce a non-native grass, that non-native grass does not have anything that likes to eat it, and it's really good at growing. So it's going to beat out the natural species, unfortunately. Let's see if I want to hit this too much. Okay, I will hit on these a little bit. So low reproductive rate, we talked about those K strategists, those big species are going to be what is going to be vulnerable to extinction. If they have a specialized situation that they live in, like the giant panda, really specialized food source or habitat. If they don't have a large distribution, like island species, if they feed at a high trophic level, so the higher up the food chain, the more likely that they're going to be affected by big changes. Fixed migratory patterns. So number one, like, so what we mean by that is they always go from California to Mexico or whatever. If they have a fixed pattern and something's happened to either of those places, that's two places that could affect their ability to survive. If they're rare, just by definition, they're going to be more at risk because there's not as many species. If they're commercially valuable, right? So there's a couple listed there. And if they need large territories, again, not if they have large territories, having a good amount of territory is a good thing. It's if they need it. So, what are the two main causes of species loss? Just to kind of recap what we've been talking about, habitat loss and degradation, number one, introduced non native species are number two. That's it for today. I know it was a long one. Thank you for hanging in.